Hey, what's going on, guys? Henry of Bro History, and today I'm talking to Jose Nino. Jose is a Second Amendment rights activist and a libertarian political analyst. And Jose just released a new book. It's called The 10 Myths of Gun Control. And I read it. It's really good, and he makes really great points. And we had a great conversation about it. So make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you like our podcast, and I hope you guys enjoy the show. So naturally, I'm pro Second Amendment. However, I live in New York, and New York has like the harshest gun laws in America. That being said, I'm still very pro Second Amendment. I don't own a gun. I've actually never fired a gun in my entire life. But what leads me down that path is just because I never want the government to have a total monopoly on force. You know what I mean? So it's basically my instincts that really bring me to my positions of being very pro Second Amendment. And I guess why you're here is to help me turn my instincts into rational thoughts. So I guess what I'll do is I'll just go down the list of myths about gun control, and you can just totally debunk them or whatever. But I guess the first thing I want to ask you is like what is your response to this? If we had laxer gun laws, society would descend into a Mad Max or Purge like society.
Well, thank you. First off, thank you for having me on, Henry. It's a pleasure always talking with you.
Absolutely.
Now, to your point about the Mad Max environments, um, here's the thing. Governments ultimately create these kind of environments with all their regulations, infringements on our property rights and our ability to transact with each other. Property rights are ultimately the basis of civilization. And guns, what the role they play is very simple. This is how we are able to secure our freedoms, defend our families, defend ourselves, and ultimately our private property. And when an individual is deprived of that, they ultimately become like a subject. They're no longer a citizen. They're no longer a free individual. And they're at the mercy of tyrants, criminals, um, guerrilla insurgents, what have you, marauders, all those kind of people. And the harsh reality is that guns are a very good deterrent against crime. And in the US, we have seen a lot of states, especially the more conservative states that have like adopted constitutional carry, the idea that you can carry a gun without a permit, and a lot of other laxer gun laws, that they've thrived. And in fact, their crime rates have continued to go down and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's a freedom thing. If you were a peaceful, law abiding individual, you have every right to carry a firearm to defend yourself and your family. And it's ultimately a check against tyranny. Because as I mentioned, a disarmed populace is a populace of subjects that is very likely able to be manipulated by governments and tyrannized by these same governments when push comes to shove. One needn't look further at present day Venezuela to see what happens when you disarm a population and implement socialism. That's why gun control has historically been a tool of authoritarians and other control freak politicians throughout human history.
Which leads me before we started speaking, I was listening to Hillary Clinton in 2016 on her campaign trail, and what I pulled up was when during I think it was a debate, she says she quotes, "I'm not here to repeal the Second Amendment. I'm not here to take away your guns. I don't want you to just be shot by someone who shouldn't have a gun in the first place." I quote Hillary Clinton. So my question is, does gun registration, does that lead to gun confiscation?
Yes, it might not be immediate, but in the long term, it does lead because gun registration gives a lot of would be authoritarian politicians a very accessible list of all the gun owners that they can target or at least pressure into turning in their guns to the authorities. And let's be honest, when you look at the left these days, they're actually pretty clever in their marketing. They'll say, "I support the Second Amendment," but in the words of the great Michael Malice, any political statement preceding "but" should be ignored. It's really just a rhetorical sleight of hand if you think about it. And any kind of gun regulation, I think, for that matter, leads towards gun confiscation or a total disarmament of the populace. That being said, I think pro-gunners should also be careful because gun controllers aren't so much anti-gun; they're just anti-gun for civilians. But when it comes to the government, like the agencies that enforce their laws, all their bureaucratic ordinances, they are very well armed. You look at like the federal government, they have more armed individuals now than there are in the Marine Corps. So they have like a legitimate army of people with the guns. The government is not going to turn in their guns, but for law-abiding citizens, that's a different story. That's why gun control is really a question of people control.
Yeah, and I don't understand that. Like most people on the left are pretty skeptical of the police, I would say, or at least at the very least, hardcore leftists are skeptical of the police. Um, I don't understand why they would want them to have a monopoly on force.
Well, um, there's definitely a lot of cognitive dissonance and good intentions with a lack of education on these issues because in my book, The 10 Myths of Gun Control, I point out that historically speaking, gun control is actually pretty racist and has been used to oppress minorities from blacks throughout the history of the United States from the colonial era to Jim Crow era, and even Asians, as witnessed with the Japanese American internment of World War II, where um, the Japanese were told to turn in their guns before they were sent off to these internment camps. Thankfully for them, they were not treated as bad as other internment camps as we've seen in history, such as like the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But that's a very thin line and risk you take whenever you let the government come in and confiscate firearms. And the left, at least the really police skeptic left, should be very careful with this because when you accept gun control, you are by definition saying the government should have the guns or they should have privileged access to the guns. It's going to only be rich people, politically connected government agents that are going to have it. But a lot of the constituents that the left supposedly champions, um, they're going to be completely left out to hang. And it's completely for naught. But this is a very important lesson about how government interventions do not do what um, they originally are intended to do, and they create a lot of unintended consequences that can be exploited by really, really bad politicians further down the line. That's why I believe that any type of government policy should always be looked at for its long-term consequences. Unfortunately, in today's era of politics, that's just not the case.
Yeah, an argument that I've heard from the left, and I have to admit that I did think about this. So I think it was Jimmy Dore. You know Jimmy Dore? He's like a big, he's like a leftist. I actually like Jimmy Dore a lot, but he brought this up on Joe Rogan's show. He said, well, if the gun rights people wanted to, um, if they wanted to stand up against the government, why didn't they use their Second Amendment rights to stand up to the government when the NSA started spying on them? So I thought that was an interesting argument.
Well, the problem with that, I think there's a conflation there. I think that has to speak more towards the culture of complacency Americans have these days when it comes to a lot of like the very gradualistic government intrusions the government has gotten away with in the last century. That being said, I think the reason why the US has not gotten into full blown tyranny, like where people do get like thrown in jail, where there are like people who get killed in protest by the government, is in large part due to the fact we have a large presence of firearms. In a lot of other countries, it takes like sometimes a matter of years, maybe at most a decade to do that. But in the United States, elites have had to like get very creative in the forms of tyranny they've tried to implement and also be gradualistic in it. The fact of the matter is most of the population in the US has been somewhat conditioned into accepting these forms of subtle forms of statism. But I think the validity of gun rights still stands irrespective of Dora's claim. I do think he brings a good point, though, that Americans are far too complacent when it comes to government encroachments, whether it be gun control, surveillance, anything like police state related, or like foreign policy interventions. We take this stuff for granted, like it's like furniture in the living room, but it's really abnormal when we look at our history. It's a complete deviation of what the US was founded upon.
So, what would you say in response to this? So, countries like Australia and the UK, I guess they wouldn't be considered they wouldn't be considered authoritarian governments. However, they have very strict gun laws. Australia went as far as to confiscate guns, and they also have low homicide rates. So, why wouldn't we want to follow in their footsteps?
Well, we have to unpack this. Um, Australia and Britain already had low crime rates before they had any type of gun control implemented. So it's a stretch to say that this is like a good example of gun control lowering crimes when you had countries that were already historically very safe and were trending safe whenever the gun control stuff was passed. And in the case, let's look at Australia. The so-called gun ban in Australia was actually a gun buyback. It was not like a ban. Like, it was just that they forced a lot of people to turn in a lot of so-called assault weapons and handguns. But interestingly enough, this after this buyback, they had like all these background checks and stuff like that. The amount of guns in circulation in Australia within a decade increased tremendously. In fact, when the gun ban was implemented, there were much less guns in Australia then than there are now. So this goes to show that there is like a demand for guns among the populace. A lot of Australians um, realize that like giving up our guns is not really a good idea in the long term. So they started to stockpile guns again. And crime rates still fell, but there's a much bigger trend. This is one problem with the left, that they will use correlation and causation to justify like all sorts of really authoritarian schemes. Now, go back to UK. UK has a similar kind of cultural trend where there's been low crime rates historically in the UK. And their gun control was also spurred by mass shootings um, in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And they've basically banned a lot of guns. But in the case of the UK, though, due to a lot of the refugee crisis that Europe has had, they've seen a huge uptick in violence like no other, especially London. And like knife crime is through the roof. In fact, the mayor of London is like calling for like knife control. And there's a ton of people that are completely defenseless. And this goes to show that even if you ban guns, like criminals will use other tools to go about committing crimes. And modern day UK is actually getting pretty Orwellian. You have mass surveillance in London, which is like the most surveilled city in the world. You have like hate speech laws where people literally for saying offensive stuff that like criticizes the EU's immigration policies or whatever could be fined or even sent to jail, as you saw with the case of Count Dankula in Scotland. And it's gotten pretty out of control there. And in fact, that might be a case of like demonstrating that when you have a disarmed population, they can be like completely at the mercy of a lot of really antisocial groups like immigrants that will not be able to assimilate and that turn to crime and potential government abuse like what they're seeing there. The Second Amendment and gun rights in general don't guarantee that you will defeat tyranny, but it's better to have it and not need it than to not have it and desperately need it in times of crisis.
Yeah, England, the UK does seem to be becoming a lot more authoritarian. And there's actually a good percentage of the people who listen to this show are actually from the UK, which is kind of funny. So I would love their feedback on this, but that Count Dankula thing was so it was so weird. Not to go totally off the rails, but like I can't believe that they were going to put this guy in jail for making a stupid video.
Yeah, I mean that's what happens when you have a culture of like statism and whatnot. Once they take away the guns or whatever, or your free speech, or they infringe on your property rights, it's all downhill from there.
So, what would you say to this? So, if if an armed civilian population, if they had a bunch of guns, that would lead to a situation like the movie Death Wish, where people are like going into subways and becoming vigilantes, and murder would go through the roof. Um, Everyone would just it would just be total chaos. So, can an armed citizen can they be trusted with firearms?
Yes, in fact, armed certain demographics of armed citizens, especially concealed handgun license holders, they're actually more law-abiding than law enforcement these days. John Lott, the famous gun researcher, has done plenty of studies on this. I actually cite this in my book as well. And the amount of gun accidents are actually very, very low when you break down the data. There's like more car accidents, more accidental drownings and whatnot, but nobody is like making a huge fuss about that, calling for car control, pool control, and stuff like that. And now the vigilante justice thing, there's just not much evidence for it either. In fact, those Wild West tropes that you hear a lot in the media, that's Hollywood. If you read the actual history of the Wild West, it's a lot safer than people realize. There were conflicts between like settlers and Indians because of like disputes of property rights. But if you were to compare a lot of the violence that went down in the Wild West to like these so-called progressive, enlightened urban centers of, say, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., or present-day Chicago, there's a lot of crime that happen in a lot of Western towns, and a lot of these Western towns had pretty loose gun rights. Um, but but there is something to point out. Gun owners historically are very good at policing themselves. They teach other gun owners how to properly use guns because there's a very good gun culture in the U.S. that's been passed down from generation to generation on how to properly use guns, and that's why you don't see people just running out in the streets trying to catch criminals and whatnot and trying to like start gunfights. The chaotic scenes that the gun control crowd warns about really just belong in Hollywood movie script. They're not based in reality.
Yeah, I agree. Everyone I know who has a gun, or I don't really know anyone in New York, but my family's from Virginia, and I do know a lot of gun owners down there. Everyone I know down there who owns a gun, they're the most responsible people on earth. Like, they're super serious about gun safety, and they would never use it for what people say that they would, like shooting a gun in a restaurant to prove a point or something. Like, that's just like an extreme example, obviously, but it just doesn't really make any sense to me, because the gun owners that I know who take it seriously, I mean, which is basically every gun owner I know, they don't fool around.
Well, I mean, there's always exceptions to the rule for a lot of statistical trends. I mean, like those people like that do like the stupid stuff, they should obviously be called out. That's why like the gun community, they self-police hard. Like at shooting ranges, if you screw up like in one bit that could potentially put somebody in danger around you, you will get taken to task. And that's how you create a culture. Ultimately, that's how you create a culture without state help. And and yeah, like gun owners are very law abiding. They're very community oriented. They know how to like handle things in a peaceful manner. The thing is, when you're a control freak politician, to manipulate people, you have to use fear. You have to use manipulation. You have to sometimes, or actually more often than not, lie and create misleading narratives and put out myths. That's why I set out to write the 10 myths of gun control, to expose these myths and give people actually the truth that guns are actually very effective in the right hands, and law-abiding citizens can easily create environments of stability that are make their communities safe and prosperous. And they also can provide a means of defense against tyrannical governance and also other very antisocial developments. It's an all-inclusive package of liberty, and it should not be infringed whatsoever.
Yeah, and like the gun control argument only really comes up on the left side is when a tragedy happens. You know what I mean? It even comes on from the right. You know, you quoted Michael Malice earlier. Michael Malice famously says conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit, which is a great quote, because I know a lot of people on the right who are like, wow, they really second thought their positions on the Second Amendment, like when the Parkland shooting happened. But it seems like on the left side, they're never looking at stats or like actual statistical data when they're trying to make a decision. They're really just using psychology to enforce policy.
Yeah, you're correct, Henry. In fact, politics is driven by emotion. It's driven by narratives that are emotionally driven. It's very effective. This is seen a lot in a lot of fields, from marketing, business, sales, and stuff like that. And it applies to politics. Most people respond to emotion more so than logic. And now your point about the right is actually kind of interesting, and it's 100% correct. Malice knocks it out of the park. I also wrote this book to point out that a lot of right-wing people, they need to fully embrace the Second Amendment. It means no infringement on gun rights, from background checks to like all these like dumb regulations on the books. All these regulations do is they keep poor people from exercising their rights, because regulations are passed on to consumers, which means it's going to be more expensive or time consuming for somebody, say, in an urban center like in Chicago, to be able to acquire a firearm that they need to protect themselves and their family. And that's what regulations are. We have to understand it's not just about blanket prohibitions. Every form of regulation that you see on the Second Amendment brings us one step closer to either gun confiscation or a de facto form of gun control apartheid, where you have political elites, the rich, or those connected to the government that have the guns, but the civilians, the unruly peasants like us, are completely disarmed. And that's the thing about gun control. It's about people control, because the government is not going to give up their guns.
Yeah, and there is a chapter in your book, "Gun Rights Are Racist." So, like, what exactly do you mean by that myth? You quote the Second Amendment in it: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And you say that militia is used as a racist dog whistle. What do you mean by that?
Well, this has been a talking point the left has been using for some time, and it gained tremendous steam when Larry King, a very reasonable guy, I don't have much of a problem with him, um, went out and said like that the Second Amendment was created specifically for slave catchers to put down rebellions from slaves. That's actually It's actually the reverse. Not only false, but it's actually the reverse. The history of the Second Amendment not only allowed people to be armed, but it allowed the creation of militias to check standing armies and check the federal government. It's rooted in decentralization. It comes from the United Kingdom, specifically the Levelers, who were these libertarian reformers in the mid 17th century that wanted to severely restrict the power of the king and his ability to raise a standing army to crush um, unruly peasants. Now, looping this back into the concept of race, if you look at the colonial era and even the first years of independence from the UK, United States, many legislatures made it a point to pass gun control specifically targeting blacks because they feared the Haitian Revolution, for example, where an armed insurrection of slaves and ex-slaves would depose the white plantation owners. So they did everything they could um, for more than a century to disarm blacks, freed or slaves. And even in the Reconstruction era, um, despite blacks gaining ostensive freedoms because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, um, they were still targeted through black codes that had gun control laws that made it very difficult for blacks to acquire firearms. And as a result, they were victims to lynchings and other forms of persecution from groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the White League throughout the South. And to this very day, um, you see it in urban centers that are predominantly minority populated. The level of violence amongst minorities is huge, and many of them fall victim to this because policing is very suspect in these areas, and B, the gun control is so bad they're essentially sitting ducks for gang violence and other stuff like that. It's a very bad environment that has failing public schools, bad drug laws, um, sometimes very repressive policing on peaceful people, and it's a really nasty environment, and adding gun control in the mix just makes it worse for many people. And yeah, as I mentioned before, with the Asian population during the Japanese internment, they were also victims of gun confiscation in order for them to be easily detained by the government and thrown in internment camps. So gun control, when you really and it would behoove friends to like actually acknowledge that, but unfortunately the media and a lot of gun control interest groups have spun it as like a tool of racism, but that's just politics as we see today. It's rooted in emotion and manipulative narrative evidence.
I think it's the word militia just like seems like a very archaic word to most people, so they automatically associate it with like 17th or 16th, like 18th or 17th century America, and they're like, well, the people back then were racist, so you want to like call up the racist people, like you want to call up those militias again when everyone was running around with guns back in the 17th and 18th century when they were racist. Like, I feel like it's just a simple use of word. It's a clever trick with words because militia, it sounds like either like a bunch of guys running around on horses shooting guns in the air, or it sounds like a terrorist group. Either or.
Well, militia. Essentially, it's just like any group of able-bodied men that could like defend themselves. If you look at the original definition of the word in the parlance of like the 18th century and 19th century, but yeah, there's been a demonization campaign. They get a lot of you mentioned because equals racist or militia equals subversive group to create the idea that these groups are violent.
I'm sorry, I missed like the past like 10 seconds of what you said. There was like a little bit of lag in the background. But I heard the ending. But yeah, it's like a causation. Like they use militia as the word to as like a word to like call up racism just because it sounds like it could be used for racism. So I have a question about just like gun laws in specific areas. So like what state or what city has the harshest gun laws, and can you like speak to how that correlates to safety?
It depends because objective criteria um you have to look at like a lot of factors, like if they have like universal background checks and stuff like that. I can name you like states. I don't know which one was like the absolute worst, but the most anti-gun states in the US tend to be like um as you mentioned, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, Hawaii, Maryland. It's basically a lot of coastal states, a lot of like states that are either coastal or have really massive urban centers. And you see a lot of gun laws ranging from universal background checks, assault weapons bans, bump stock bans, um, mandatory safe storage laws. It's just like a whole bunch of stuff that piles on to block law-abiding people from owning guns. I'm looking at this right now. Guns and Ammo magazine claims that New York is the most anti-gun state, followed by New Jersey, then Massachusetts.
So so like I don't think most people understand what a universal background check is. Like can you explain what that looks like?
Yeah, universal background check essentially closes any kind of loophole, or better yet, it regulates every firearm transaction imaginable in the US, meaning that if I gift a gun to like a friend or a family member, I have to write in a piece of paper that I transfer this gun. I have to fill out a piece of paper and I have to send it to the government. Any kind of sale, whether it's in private at a gun store, gun show, or a basic transfer or gift, that falls under a universal background check. You have to document it and all of that stuff.
So who would be most affected by a universal background check?
I would say very likely minorities and the poor, because it adds another form of regulation that wastes money and time, which a lot of poor people simply don't have. And rich people, they can shoulder that. That's like an inconvenience for them. But for a lot of people of humbler means, any kind of bureaucracy that's added to like an activity um, will basically deter them from doing it, or they just go broke because it's just too costly. And a lot of law-abiding people transfer firearms from family members because it's a relatively economical way of passing down firearms as heirlooms and means of defense from one generation to the other.
So if like a father wanted to pass down a rifle, a hunting like a rifle that's just solely used for hunting to his son, they would have to go and fill out a form and submit that to whatever state.
Yeah, I mean, there's universal background check laws are not uniform, but that tends to be the case in some of these states. that is very much the case. There are exemptions in certain states where, for hunting rifles, they tend to be exempt, but for like say like a handgun or a so-called assault weapon, um, they'll they'll start cracking down on those. Um, I think what you see these days is that handguns and so-called assault weapons that have like menacing cosmetic features tend to be targeted more.
So you bring up there's a really interesting chapter in your book, and I think this is where a lot of people on the right actually capitulate to gun control. You say mental health legislation can prevent shootings, and that's a myth. What does mental health legislation look like? Like what does mental health legislation look like in terms of actual policy? Because I feel like that's what a lot of people on the right will say. They're like, well, I believe in the Second Amendment. However, I believe that there should be mental health checks.
They'll use a wide range of criteria. For example, like if you're on antidepressants or whatever, or like basic common medication, in some states you could be like legitimately stripped of your gun rights or subject to some kind of um, gun control regulation, or just visiting like a psychiatrist or whatnot. Now, for like the truly like mentally insane, there's a lot of judicial practices that take care of that. Um, that they're already like, for the most part, they'll be committed or separated from society if they pose such a threat. Um, you don't really need like a massive like state or new laws to do that. That's been around in common law since this country was founded, and there's plenty of precedents for that. You don't need to create this new cutting edge mental health legislation to do that. More often than not, really the whole end game of mental health legislation is a very clever way of implementing tyranny, because this is straight out of the Soviet Union's playbook. The way the Soviet Union was able to detain so many people and jail people in general for political reasons was they declared them as insane, mentally ill, and that's a very easy way to get people to accept tyranny, because who doesn't think that mentally ill people should be kept from the rest of society, when a lot of these people, the only defect they had was they were just disagreeing with the government. That's it. And we do set a very slippery slope, because the state, its nature is to grow, and it attracts the worst people possible. So when you give them the ability to start categorizing people as mentally ill and whatnot, you open up a whole Pandora's box of potential government abuse. And one interesting point that a lot of people don't realize: mentally ill people actually tend to be the victims of gun violence, not the perpetrators, more often than not, if you look at the evidence. So this is a very sensitive subject that's nuanced, and also filled with a lot of trap doors that I think you have to be very careful. That's why I tell a lot of people on the right, you guys need to stop buying into these talking points of mental health legislation. You have to realize most mentally ill people are actually pretty peaceful, and using this is just another example of the left using some class of people for political gain to advance a very, very misleading and ultimately tyrannical narrative.
Yeah, I think it's because like for the most part, mentally ill people are pretty voiceless. You know, they don't have a lobby or something or someone speaking for them. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So like another thing that a lot of people on the right capitulate to is that so like gun-free zones prevent mass shootings. So I mean, is there any truth to that? Do gun-free zones do they actually prevent tragedies like the Parkland shooting?
No, in fact, the evidence John Lott has found is that 98% of mass shootings take place in gun-free zones. So, like, it's overwhelming, and it makes sense. because in gun-free zones, you have a bunch of sitting ducks ultimately, and most of these schools have already lackluster security systems when it comes to security guards and stuff like that. So it's a shooting galore for a deranged lunatic to come in and rack up a massive kill count because they're not going to face much resistance. When seconds count, the cops are ultimately minutes away. And yes, the right has culpability in this because the Gun Free Zone Schools Act of the 1990s was signed in of 1990 was signed into law by George H.W. Bush, and this was like a so-called common sense gun control regulation, and it has done nothing to prevent or impede mass shootings. Though there is evidence that mass shootings have decreased somewhat over the past 20 years, but there's also a lot of confounding factors because of cultural norms. There's better self-policing in schools these days, and stuff like that. But if you look at the evidence, the highest shootings in the U.S. when it comes to body counts, they all take place in gun-free zones for the most part, like overwhelmingly.
A gun-free zone almost sounds like an invitation for somebody who's sick in the head, who wants to murder people, to proceed with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a safe space for criminals, for mass murderers, and stuff like that. And this is another really good point that a Second Amendment advocate actually pointed out. When we're talking about mass shootings, the perpetrator should always be framed as a murderer, not so much as a shooter, because this is also a really clever rhetorical trick. Think about it. A shooter can be anyone, could be like a competitive shooter at your shooting range that does nothing wrong. Could be you hunting, you're a shooter. But this is another really clever trick that the left employs to associate the idea person with gun equals shooter, therefore he will commit a mass shooting, when in reality it has to do more with the fact that there are really, really messed up people that will take advantage of really flawed gun control laws to hurt other defenseless people.
But according to Obama, I think, and you quote this in your book, Obama said it's easier to buy a gun than a book or fresh vegetables or something along the lines of that. I might be paraphrasing him, but like how easy is it to obtain a gun if you're just a random kid?
Well, the last time I checked, I didn't have to go through a background check, a go through fingerprinting depending on the state you're in, or pay a fee or pay like a permit fee just to rent a book or buy vegetables. The process to buy guns in the U.S. and even sell them to, if you want to be a firearms dealer, is quite extensive. It's not like you just walk in and walk out within minutes. Um, and a lot of this has to just do with the fact the left, again, they like appealing to emotions and not caring about the facts. They'll convince people that it's so easy to buy guns, but try telling that to somebody who wants to defend themselves in Washington, D.C. or Chicago, how easy it is to buy a gun. It's almost impossible in those places because of so many regulations. And that's only when you factor in their state laws. You have federal laws. You have the NICS background check, which that system does reject law-abiding people, unfortunately, from exercising their gun rights because it mixes and matches them with criminals that have the same first or same last names. And yeah, the current guns policy status quo in the US, it's not a completely liberated gun market. Yes, it's less restrictive than, say, like Australia or like the UK, but to say that it's completely unregulated is misleading at best.
So I got one last question for you, and then we'll plug your book and everything. But I think this is the most important question because I think there's so much like misinformation about this topic that it confuses everyone. I think most people who are even very pro Second Amendment are confused about this. But your last chapter, assault weapons bans are an effective form of gun control. So I think the first thing that we need to tackle is like, what is an actual assault weapon?
It is a politically invented term that gun controllers have used since the 1980s to attack certain weapons like the AR-15, um, that have like menacing cosmetic features that look like, say, an assault rifle, which is a burst fire or fully automatic fire weapon that's only accessible to the military or people that will be willing to go through insane amounts of regulatory hoops to acquire. Um, this whole thing is a fear mongering scheme to get people to like embrace gun control because it creates the whole idea that people are carrying automatic weapons normally out on the streets. I will say this: I believe I am like a Second Amendment purist, and the Second Amendment means that you can carry um, military grade weapons and whatnot. If we live truly in a free society, you should be able to do so. But this stuff is now this whole so-called assault weapons campaign is really more of a political type of ploy to condition people into thinking that you have like machine gun toting madmen walking on the streets mowing people down every day when it's really not the case. And if you look at a lot of evidence, fully automatic weapons have not really been used a lot of shootings in the US historically. And there's also good reasons for it because these are very unwieldy weapons that are hard to conceal. If you're a criminal, more often than not, you're wanting to get in and get out of the place. Yeah, you'll kill maybe like a few people, but you want to get away from your target and then carry out your robbery successfully. And carrying like a huge machine gun that's like used by the military and stuff like that really defeats the purpose. That's why most criminals, when they go in the black market or whatever type of market to acquire their firearms, they end up getting like your typical semi-automatic handguns, shotguns, maybe some rifles and stuff like that. But yeah, assault weapons bans, they're present in a lot of really anti-gun states. The evidence shows they're very ineffective. They tend to cover arbitrary firearms that are not just rifles, but sometimes even handguns. And it's just a way of kind of conditioning people into accepting gun bans because the left, one thing that the left has done really well in the United States for the past century is incrementalism, meaning they are able to progressively get more and more regulation into people's lives and build off of that to ultimately subjugate them. And these all these tactics they use, there's a much larger end game. They know they might not get everything they want, but they continue pushing the envelope nevertheless. That's why they pursue assault weapons bans, red flag gun confiscation orders, universal background checks, mandatory safe storage laws. They're ready to throw the kitchen sink. They're ready to use whatever scheme possible to make an entrance and intrude on our gun rights.
Something I saw, when like the 3D gun printing was out in the news and everyone was freaking out about it. There was like these really funny memes that came out, and I saw this meme where it's like, oh, my printer's on the fritz, and they have like a bunch of M4s lined up like next to their printer, and like, my printer's on the fritz, I can't stop it. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't seen that meme specifically, but I can comment on 3D printable firearms. I like the idea. It's defense distributed is like democratizing gun ownership in a way that no other gun company or gun organization has ever done. It's still like in its embryonic stages, but the idea is great because it will, if successful, um, it will shift the power from the state to the individuals when it comes to the provision and maintenance of firearms. We want to ultimately be able to check the government. The Second Amendment's purpose is a tool to prevent tyrannical governments and ultimately free the people. And I think Defense Distributed is one of the latest steps to kind of bring us back to the foundational premises of the Second Amendment.
Well, what would you say to the Second Amendment was written in a different time when people didn't have these mass killing machines and all this crazy stuff that could kill 20 people in 30 seconds, or whatever those talking points are. What would you say to that in a closing note?
I would say the Second Amendment is timeless, and as history has shown, tyranny has been the norm of human existence for the past 5,000 years since the creation of the modern state. And I would say that it is a very good insurance policy against it. And whenever you have a disarmed populace, look at Venezuela, look at Soviet Union, look at the Nazi Germany. Whenever a certain group or the entire populace is disarmed, you would just invite tyranny and all forms of abuse. And this type of policy was one of the most revolutionary policies that the founding fathers envisioned for this country. And this should be replicated all over the world, to be honest. And it just serves as a lesson that tyranny does not happen overnight. And the fight for restoring and maintaining our liberties is a constant battle. So I would say to most people is that we have to go back to basics and understand um, the historical context of the framing of the Second Amendment, what the founding fathers' intention was, and just look at history, comparative history, with how civilizations collapse or descend into tyranny to understand why the founding fathers put it there in the first place.
Jose, where can everyone buy your book, The 10 Myths of Gun Control?
Um, yes, you can go on my Twitter. I have it pinned at Jose Al Nino. Um, it's out. It's on Gumroad, GUMROAD.com. The 10 Myths of Gun Control. If you browse there, um, but you can find it on my Twitter. Also, I have a Facebook page that's Jose Nino that's also pinned, and it's on pre-sale for now until Wednesday. So get it at this discounted price. This is, in my opinion, the most concise yet like definitive refutation of all the gun control myths that you'll see, and will really educate you ultimately on why gun rights are absolutely necessary if we want a free and secure society. So I would grab your copy on my Twitter page or Facebook page, and I could send you a link as well if you want to share it on your show notes to my page. But the discounted price is only gonna last until 12 a.m. Wednesday. So buy it now, or you'll have to pay the regular price as of Wednesday.
Okay, I'm gonna have all those. I'm gonna have those links all in the description. This is great, man. Everyone, the 10 myths of gun control, debunking fake news and media lies about guns. Make sure you check it out. I had the opportunity to read it, and I 100% recommend it. And Jose, I mean, thanks for joining me again, man. You're the master of many trades, like Venezuela now, gun control. It's pretty cool that you have such a diverse knowledge on a lot of different topics.
Well, thank you so much, Henry, for having me on. You do run a great show and allow for great conversations with some of like the sharpest minds in the liberty movement, and it's a pleasure to always chat and share knowledge and promote our my products and whatnot. And these days we do need more dialogue. We do need more perspectives on these issues.